אני מאוד שמחה לפתוח את מושב הבוקר של היום האחרון של הכנס הנהדר הזה. וכן, מכיוון שרוב הדוברים דוברים באנגלית, אז אנחנו נעבור לפחות בהקשר הזה לאנגלית. The title of our session today, this morning, discusses Jerusalem as a source of attraction and disappointment. And actually, when reading the title, I couldn't resist looking for a quotation from Salma Lagerlöf, a Nobel Prize winner for her book Jerusalem. I don't know if you remember, but her book is split into two parts, and in the first part, and it tells the story of the Swedes, the Swedish community that joined the American colony here in Jerusalem. And in the first part of the book, they still live in Sweden together in a utopian community that holds in their common room a picture of Jerusalem, a city surrounded with wonderful high walls above which one can see its houses topped with red roofs, full with greenery, bell towers of churches, and in front of the city there are men walking with their best clothes and their walking sticks, and women riding carriages in the green fields that surround the city. In the second part, they are already here in Jerusalem. One of them is dying, and his friends take him on a stretcher to see the city before he dies. He sees the great stone walls, the beggars, the lepers. He smells the stench and does not understand why his friends take him there when he wants to see the real Jerusalem. But then he realizes that, and that's the quotation, they do it this way to make me even more happy later when I pass through the high gate into the glorious city of God. And I think this quotation from Salma Lagerlöf will be an excellent stepping stone for our session today. And I want to introduce our first speaker, Anthony Bale, a professor of medieval studies at Birkbeck College in the University of London. He published on medieval pilgrimage to Jerusalem, including editing and translating two important medieval accounts of Jerusalem. One was Mandeville's Books of Marvels and Travels, 2012, and the other was the Book of Marjorie Kemp in 2016. His new book, A Travel Guide to the Middle Ages, explores the medieval world through travel guides and travel writing, and will be published by Penguin in 2023. And I was very happy to read that it will be published in Hebrew in Keter in 2024. So thank you very much. And he'll be talking about the Pilgrim's Disappointment, medieval narratives of arrival at Jerusalem and the port of Jerusalem. Please.
Thank you very much. Toda and Boker Tov. I'm sorry my Hebrew isn't good enough to give my whole lecture, so thank you also for the simultaneous translation. And thanks for the invitation and for all the organization to kind of get me here and to bring us all together. It's been a great conference. So my research is on travel, mainly pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the later Middle Ages. And I'm going to talk today about one small part of that research, and that's the role of disappointment in the Holy Land. Travelers who didn't find what they thought they would find when they arrived here. I know it's a shame to start the day on such a kind of negative note. As Bianca Kunal said in her lecture on Tuesday, for medieval Christians, traveling to Jerusalem could be the highest purpose a human life could attain. To go to the Holy Land was to gain righteousness, glory, joy, comfort, and pleasure. That was the idea, that was the theory. It's clear from surviving travelers' accounts that the journey was very often an ordeal, and that the physical experience of being here was not quite the experience that pilgrims had expected. So my paper today really is a corrective to the idea of Jerusalem as heaven on earth. It's important that we don't become complicit in romanticizing Jerusalem, and that we don't focus selectively only on the spiritual or intellectual aspects of Jerusalem, but that we understand too that it was a physical place of suffering and strife and disappointment. So one of the points that I want to make about my whole paper is not just that medieval travel was difficult, that we know, but also that medieval writers often focused on their difficulties. They didn't try and hide them, they often wrote explicitly about them. So I'm going to talk today about a couple of travellers from the later Middle Ages and say a few words about how we might understand their reactions to the Holy Land. So to start with, I want to direct our attention to a corner of this famous image. You can see the red dot. This famous image which accompanied Bernard von Breidenbach's 1480s pilgrimage account to the Holy Land. And in the bottom left-hand corner is the image of the pilgrims arriving at Jaffa. And what you can see are these kind of broken down caves, desolate caves, and the pilgrims getting out of the sea here, coming from their boat there, and being shown to these caves and this broken down kind of church on a hill. This was a far from unique rendering of Jaffa. Sorry, that's the close-up of it with their broken down caves. And there's a similar representation here of Jaffa as a set of ruins. By the mid-14th century, the port's desolation had become well known, almost proverbial. After the 1340s and the establishment of the custodia, Jaffa was generally the only port that the Mamluk authorities allowed Western pilgrims to land in, and there was a rudimentary centre here for processing the visitors. Increasingly in the 14th and 15th centuries, Jaffa was called the Port of Jerusalem, reflecting its status as the main maritime gateway for visitors who arrived in Venetian galleys from the west. Now, the first account of arrival at Jaffa, I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry. The first account of arrival at Jaffa I want us to consider is that of the anonymous Englishman in the 1340s. And he describes how he sailed from the ruined city of Acre down the coast, past Atlit, and then he arrived at Jaffa, and there appeared, this is the bit in bold, there appeared 3, then 4 or 5 men of great stature on war horses among the bushes, as if one were driving birds out of thickets, alongside many foot soldiers with swords and spears and Turkish bows, some of whom were as black as soot, and they encircled the shore like bees attacking us, like a fire amongst thorns. Those of you who know your Bible will see this is a direct quote of Psalm 117. Circumdederunt me sicut apes et exacerunt sicut ignis in spinis. They, like bees or like thorns. And with a great fuss between our captain and the Saracens, the word then went out amongst our brethren that they would sell us or plunder us. A conjecture underpinned by reality, since 6 of the Saracens dismounted their horses, huge and bulky men with long beards, white like linen, and they asked that our boat be hauled ashore, and they marvelled at it and examined it in a search. And God, who does not forget the cries of the poor, freed us from the evildoers and saved us from bloody men. He goes on to say that in the evening they rowed into the port at Jaffa with great difficulty and related the port to the story of Jonah, who left Jaffa and paid the fee to go to Tarshish in the Bible. He then was taken to Ramla by the Mamluk officer, the admiral of Ramla, with us agreeing before him, having made a pledge of words on top of a hefty payment. He gave us 2 Saracens to escort us to Jerusalem, and they led us to a heavily fortified compound that is a place like a fortress, of which the Sultan has made many in that land, in which pilgrims and merchants sleep in order to be safe from the Saracens. So this 14th century account contains lots of features that we see over and over again in narratives of pilgrims' arrival. First, the focus on ruins and desolation, all the way from Beirut to Gaza, and there was a kind of sadness at the passing of the Crusaders' glories. This was accompanied by a more general sense of the desolate landscape and the hostile locals, who appear variously as Saracens, Moors, Muslims, Turks, infidels. And at the same time, we see this very active administrative role of the Mamluks in registering and taking money from the pilgrims. And the expense, the great expense of the journey quickly becomes a main feature. The money seems to flow from the pilgrims for every single thing. And often in pilgrims' accounts, these costs will be listed. And then you'll also have these attempts, like the pilgrim does here with the reference to the Psalms and to Jonah, to make biblical parallels with the pilgrim's experience, even though they're often not very convincing or profound. So the parallel here is that just as Jonah paid the fee to go to Tarshish, the pilgrim will pay the fee to go to Jerusalem. Konrad Grunenberg, arriving about 140 years later, gives a very similar and detailed account of arrival at Jaffa. Grunenberg was the son of the mayor of Constance in southern Germany, and he wrote a very detailed but quite depressed and miserable account of his pilgrimage of 1486. And he also described how his boat was held outside Jaffa, and then they were rowed into the infidel port, and there he received the indulgence that pilgrims got from stepping on shore. He describes how all the pilgrims carried a big, heavy bag of food, wine, eggs, cheese, a comb, shaving things, with them. And then the locals came and gaped at them. But I want to draw our attention to the bit in bold, this paragraph here. The infidels brought us to two ancient caves in a hill where they, as well as their donkeys, had, pardon the expression, shat all over the place, so that the stench was incredibly filthy. They gave us a handful of straw, or rather we had to pay several marchetti for it, or else they would whack you or pull out your beard. We lay 2 days in said holes or caves. Christians of the girdle, which kind of often means Coptic or Syriac or Georgian Christians, they're never quite clear on what they mean. Christians of the girdle gave us bread, grapes, cooked meat, rice, or some kind of porridge, as well as hard-boiled eggs. And infidel merchants came too, with beads, rosaries, and other things for sale. The infidels treated us in a beastly manner, especially at night. If someone wanted to get out, to go to the toilet, to answer the call of nature near the hole, they grabbed him and demanded money. If you paid up, for marchetti mostly, they would let you go, but if you refused to pay, they would whack you and throw you back in the hole. During our last night there, an important knight from our party was so badly beaten up that he died the next day. Then Grunenberg adds, Jaffa was once a pretty well-defended town, but is now much in decline, and of the citadel there remain only 2 towers and some fragments of the wall. The prophet Jonah fled from Jaffa to Tarshish. So, like Jonah, Grunenberg too fled Jaffa as soon as he could, but he left for his reader this picture of the desolation and the rudimentary, miserable accommodation there. Grunenberg's worry about toilets and the management of his bowels, and this is a very common concern for medieval travellers, speaks very directly to the earthly and bodily aspects of travel rather than to the spiritual ones. And these details, some of his details, are echoed in my third account, Thomas Lark's account of Richard Guilford's journey to Jerusalem in 1506, where Lark says that the Mamluks and Saracens welcomed the pilgrims by putting them in a grotto or cave all day upon the bare, stinking stable ground, by night and by day, evilly entreated by the Moors. Treated really evilly by the Moors. Sorry, I didn't translate this, I forgot. Lark also mentions Jonah in that last line. And at this haven, Jonah the prophet took to the sea when he fled from the sight of our Lord. Now, in medieval Christianity, Jonah was a symbol of patience. And the pilgrims' patience in Jaffa seems to be the parallel with Jonah that they want to draw out here, that they also have to be patient. So these 3 examples I've just introduced very quickly to show that over and over again we see a contrast between the zeal of the pilgrim and the joy of arrival with the awful circumstances of Mamluk Jaffa. The other key moment of disappointment we find, paradoxically, is the moment of entry into Jerusalem. At the moment of stepping inside the city, every pilgrim received full forgiveness for their sins, a plenary indulgence. So this was one of the most valuable places in the world, spiritually speaking. But if medieval travellers found spiritual nourishment on first entering Jerusalem, it would have been in spite of, rather than because of the environment in which they'd put themselves. The first thing recorded by the Englishman William Way entering in 1458 is that local boys threw stones at him. Felix Fabry of Ulm in 1480 describes how young locals gathered round him and laughed at him and his companions as they wept outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fabry also noticed Eastern Christians scandalously sitting around playing games like dice out of superstition in the dilapidated vaults of former churches. Almost all Western visitors comment on Jerusalem's disarray: churches in ruins, broken altars, Crusader monuments shockingly turned over to Islam. Meshullam of Volterra, a Jewish pilgrim visiting from Italy in 1481, likewise described how he was ill at death's door from the moment he arrived in Jerusalem until he left what he described as its ruinous state. The first impression of Pietro Cassola, visiting from Italy in 1494, was that the entire Holy Land was desperate, and as he arrived in Jerusalem, he and his companions were almost dead from heat and thirst. He complains here about the road from Ramla to Jerusalem, the desolate houses with goats living in them. The country seemed very bare and wild, with no fruit and no beautiful fountains. It's not at all like Italy. And then they arrive in Jerusalem, almost dead of heat and thirst, and the Mamluk dogs made us dismount outside the city near the castle of the Pisans, which is the Tower of David. All the pilgrims fared badly. Not a single person was satisfied with the prior of Mount Zion. All the friars shrugged their shoulders because there was nothing they could do to treat the pilgrims as well as they used to. And then they were ordered not to leave the house, so they were kind of prisoners in the Franciscan monastery there. After arrival, most pilgrims were led to the Muristan, the lodging house for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was generally described as being absolutely disgusting. Felix Fabry estimated that 400 pilgrims lodged there in squalid and ruinous conditions, and other medieval visitors comment on the filth, stench, and constant noise there. So I could give lots more accounts like this, but I think I've made my point that arrival in Jaffa and Jerusalem was often not experienced as a climax, as an aliyah, but as an example of culture shock, where European visitors found people and places and facilities that didn't meet their expectations or their needs. Now, some pilgrims could easily turn this into an element of their via crucis, as they suffered like Jesus in the very streets in which he had suffered. So some pilgrims, like Marjorie Kemp or Bridget of Sweden, tell us very little about their physical experience of Jerusalem. For other pilgrims, a better way to understand their grim accounts of the Holy Land is through the idea of culture shock, which gained currency amongst anthropologists in the 1960s, and is used specifically in studies of tourism to describe the process by which travellers experience shock or discomfort or negative feelings when they visit a culture which is different from what they'd expected or new to them. In these accounts, culture shock has a kind of U-shaped experience, happiness to sadness, as time goes on. Culture shock in these accounts either gives way to adjustment and adaptation and self-conceptualization. So the traveller must adapt to some elements of the culture to which they've travelled and then conceptualize the landscape according to their own beliefs, mastering the new culture on their terms in order to make their journey useful, enjoyable, or bearable. We can see a similar U-curve in medieval pilgrims' accounts. There's the initial infatuation with the idea of Jerusalem, a moment of euphoria in pilgrims' accounts, which tends to occur from sea with the first sight of the Holy Land, as the boats arrive from Cyprus, or at Nabi Samuel at Mount Joy, as pilgrims first see the city of Jerusalem. And this is followed by the bitter shock of arrival. We see some elements of pilgrims adjusting, often to the expense, to food, and to discomfort. But we also see a trajectory of self-conceptualization. Pilgrims resolve their disappointment of arrival by actually going back to their own language of the Bible and to their own liturgy. So according to theories of intercultural communication, the tourist's mastery of the place they're visiting depends on them either engaging with the culture or seeing past it, not seeing it, finding ways to be at home even when they're abroad. So in other words, culture shock can be resolved either by cultural intelligence, by being sensitive to one's surroundings, or by the tourist gaze of taking recourse to your pre-existing values. Now, medieval pilgrims weren't allowed to wander around Jerusalem. They were subject to constant regulations by the Mamluks, but also led to place by Franciscan friars. And increasingly, they subjected themselves to a kind of ordo peregrinationis, an itinerary of holy sites, which became the Stations of the Cross and the Via Dolorosa. The Franciscans sold little booklets, and we see in this account how at Mount Zion, Thomas Lark was given a piece of paper with the relics of holy places about Jerusalem, which they were given by the Franciscans and were told to use as a kind of guide to the city. So the sacred landscape itself became read and experienced not as an intercultural encounter, but through a pre-existing script. The East became westernized through citation. So to conclude very briefly, I want to kind of, my summary is that the contemporary city ceases to exist through mnemonic habits like the Via Dolorosa, and instead attention could be redirected to biblical text and to remembered places. Richard Guilford, who Thomas Lark wrote his account of, became seriously ill on his journey to Jerusalem and actually died on reaching Mount Zion. Lark, writing about his illness, complained a great deal about the cost of hiring camels to bring Guilford from Ramla to Jerusalem, the outrageous expense. The whole journey had been a disaster, but Lark continued with his pilgrimages around the city's holy site. At the same time, Lark describes how when Guilford died, a huge service was put on for him at Mount Zion. He was buried there, the friars made a solemn service, and all the pilgrims came. Guilford's death, before he could set foot in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was turned into a moment of glory and communal devotion, the ultimate reconceptualization of the ordeal of travel into spiritual reward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we only have to hope that pilgrims' experience nowadays is different. I would like to welcome Professor Maria Dorninger as our second speaker. She teaches medieval German literature at the Department of German Studies at the Paris-Lodron-Universität in Salzburg, member of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, member of the Center for Jewish Cultural History. Her research interests and publications are on Johann Raser, images of Judaism and women of the Bible in medieval German literature, travel accounts with a focus on pilgrim accounts of Jerusalem travelers in the late medieval period and early modern times. And out of her very long list of publications, I will mention her last book, 2017, Per Secula, Jerusalem Bilder und Rezeption in Literatur, Musik und Kunst, and Memory and Representations of Jerusalem in Medieval and Early Modern Pilgrimage Reports in Visual Constructs of Jerusalem, edited by Bianca Kuchnel, Galit Noga-Banai, and Hannah Vorholt. Maria, please. Thank you.
And I want to thank you also, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi Institute, for invitation, and all the organizers, just to mention Orit Ramon, Nico Daba, or Rechav Rubin, just for others. My paper is not so much about disappointment, just a little, tzat, but not that much. So it's more positive in a way. This analysis focuses on the central role of Jerusalem for medieval pilgrims and discusses this mainly on the example of medieval German language pilgrim accounts. The importance of Jerusalem for travel literature or Christian pilgrimage shows by the quantity of the transmission. This is Arnold of Haaf. He is kind of a pilgrim brother through this paper. This importance shows by the quantity of transmission of pilgrim reports. The works of Reinhold Röhricht and Heinrich Messner, you know them, already bear witness to this. Only for the period from 1320 to 1520, Ursula Ganz-Blättler gives the number of 2060 known pilgrim accounts. Also, this number has now increased. For one's own memoria, for memory, for posterity, or future travelers, pilgrims could make notes, sketches, or even after the return accounts. You know, there also exist pilgrim guides, but in pilgrim accounts, the author is more present. In doing so, writing pilgrim accounts, one was not afraid to refer to or to interpolate notes or explanations of others. However, this and other problems associated with pilgrim accounts are not considered here. The frequency of these pilgrim accounts led Dietrich Huschenbett to speak of a genre of its own, for which he suggested the term Palestine pilgrim accounts. To me, the term Jerusalem pilgrim account seems more precise, because even if the pilgrims traveled from Jerusalem to the Holy Land and further to Sinai or Egypt, so Jerusalem was always in the focus of every pilgrimage to the Nearest East in medieval times. However, for the medieval Christian or non-Christian pilgrim, Jewish pilgrim, Jerusalem was the center not only of the Holy Land, but also of the world. This uniqueness of Jerusalem and its centrality may be connected with different contexts that are linked to each other. The religious, historical one, which causes a certain internationality, and second, the geographic concept or position of Jerusalem. This centrality of Jerusalem and its description in German pilgrim accounts will be shown in the following. As today, medieval pilgrims did not travel without, if I may say so, a mental baggage. As Friederike Hassauer has discussed related to Santiago de Compostela pilgrims, every traveler disposes over two categories of knowledge. First, knowledge of topos, which includes any written authoritative knowledge, such as the Bible, and second, knowledge of experience and observations. Each of these categories of knowledge affect and structure the traveler's perception. These categories also allow to verify and structure new experience, also by the means of comparison that provides reference points. Important for these subjects are the works of Arnold Esch. For Memoria, I want to mention Aleida Assmann. And Bernhard Jahn speaks of the traveler's mental map, a notion from geography. This mental map is under the influence of one's own different cultural and social circumstances. It is present also in the accounts, as accounts do not only describe the other, but also mirror one's own dispositions or cultural concepts. Religious teachings and impressions shaped the mental map and the traveler's knowledge of topos in the Middle Ages. In the churches, one could hear about Jerusalem, where central events of Christian salvation history had taken place, and there gain visual impressions. Each church building also referred metaphorically to the heavenly Jerusalem, as well as the earthly Jerusalem to the heavenly in hermeneutic concepts. The so-called Mappe Mundi, oriented to the history of salvation, show the central importance of Jerusalem and depict Jerusalem in the center of the world. An impressive example for this is the Ebsdorf world map created around 1300. The Holy Sepulchre with the resurrected Christ is shown in the center of the Earth's circular globe and represents the city of Jerusalem, while Christ holds the whole world. This religious centrality of Jerusalem shows in the writings of Jewish prophets. Their verses emphasize Jerusalem's religious and political importance and the unique geographical position. For example, in the book of Ezekiel 5:5, the Almighty speaks, "This is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations and the countries round about." According to Jeremiah 3:17, the throne and dwelling place of God is also located in the city, namely in the cult center, Ezekiel 48:8. in the temple of the Temple Mount on Mount Moriah. This is the central place of Jewish ancient and religious history where Abraham was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, Genesis 22. According to the prophetic religious account, Jerusalem, and therefore this place, could also become the center of the world, its navel, as expressed by the prophet Ezekiel 38:12. Thus, for the historian Flavius Josephus, Bellum Judaicum 3:52, Jerusalem presented the navel of the world. Therefore, also for late medieval Jewish travelers, the Temple Mount was the city's most important site, as it was for the just mentioned merchant Meshulam da Volterra, a friend of Lorenzo di Medici, who traveled from Florence to Jerusalem in 1481. For Christianity, the veneration of the holy sites of Christ's ministry was promoted by the building activity of Emperor Constantine. According to Klaus Bieberstein, whose thesis has been endorsed by many researchers, Emperor Constantine's building program in the Holy Land was influenced by the doctrines of the Council of Nicaea in 322. With the construction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a site existed that included the essential events of Christian salvation history and invited to worship and pilgrimage. This religious centrality of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is repeatedly portrayed in the Jerusalem pilgrim accounts. However, in the 14th century, the desktop traveler Jean de Mandeville or Jean de Mandeville expressed clearly Jerusalem's uniqueness in his account, which became a European bestseller. According to the biblical books, he states that God gave the Holy Land first to the Jewish people. Indirectly, Mandeville also expresses God's esteem for the Jewish people, since he describes the land as the noblest, most worthy, and best on earth, which therefore Christ also chose for his saving act. Wann das Land, I quote, von erst der Juden war's, und das Land hätt ihn unser Herr erkoren, als auch das Land das edelst und würdigst und das Bestland war's. In addition, there is another aspect that was crucial for Christ's salvation deeds in Jerusalem, regarding to Mandeville, the central location of the city of Jerusalem. Mandeville illustrates the choice of Jerusalem as the center of the world with the example of the approach of heralds. Quote, that our Lord God died for us in Jerusalem, he did so because it is in the midst of the world, as I said before, that it might resound the better in all the places of the world. For you know well that when one's to command, cry out, or proclaim something, one always starts in the middle of a square or in the middle of the city. Therefore, Christ wished to suffer his death in the midst of the world, that everyone might rightly know and hear and see this. The significance of Christ's saving work thus corresponds to the centrality of the place, just as the place of Abraham's readiness for Isaac's sacrifice corresponds to the holiest Jewish site. Consequently, according to Mandeville's conception, Calvary, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is the holiest site of Christianity and at the same time the center of the world. This transfer of the center of the world to the Temple Mount, from the Temple Mount to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, seems to be apparent in the 14th century. Cyril of Jerusalem had called Calvary the navel of the world. Before him, however, Melito of Sardis in the 2nd century had already indicated the place of the crucifixion of Christ in the center somewhere of Jerusalem. First, beginnings for a shift of the Isaac sacrifice to Calvary could already be in the 14th century. Possibly, typological interpretations had an effect on this. According to Kiel, the center of the world is related to Calvary in the 16th century. Only since 725, the navel of the world is attested in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at the present place now in the Greek Orthodox choir. This shift had probably occurred after the restoration of the damage to the church, since parts of it were destroyed during the capture of Jerusalem by the Persian great king Khosrau II. Nevertheless, in a certain sense, there remains an awareness of the Temple Mount as the original central holy site connected to the existence of Solomon's and the Herodian temple. In later pilgrim accounts, this becomes clear in the description of the so-called Templum Salomonis, actually the Dome of the Rock, which, although not original, becomes to some extent symbolic of the Jewish temple complexes on the plateau. Its importance, or that of the holy place, is evident in the descriptions of the later pilgrim reports. Along with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it is usually one of the most extensively depicted and described buildings in Jerusalem. For example, the Nuremberg patrician Hans Tucher, he traveled 1479 to Jerusalem. He not only describes the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in detail in his account, but also emphasizes in a special way the architecture and significance of Solomon's temple as a Jewish sanctuary that Christ also visited. The description mentions the temple as the building of King Solomon, as a place that God loved very much, as a place of sacrifice for the priest, as the place where King David saw an angel and Jeremiah was held captive. And its venerability started through its connection with Abraham, who met the king Melchizedek at his side, and so on. As for the center of the world or its navel, hardly any pilgrim account of the late Middle Ages forgets to mention it. Probably, under Franciscan influence, the interpretation of the special place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as the navel of the world was attributed to Christ. Not entirely satisfied with this religious interpretation, some pilgrims, including the preacher Felix Fabri of Ulm in 1483, made attempts to empirically prove this place as the center of the world. Thus, Fabri writes, "There is a round hole in the ground in the middle of the choir. Here is the center of the world, and it is said that Jesus stood there and said to his disciples, 'Behold, this is the center of the world.' To this, it is said that the ancient astronomers and mathematicians, astrologers and geographers had a marble column placed in this place long before the time of Christ. And when it was none, when day and night were of equal length, the column gave no shade. Some of our pilgrim brothers wanted to verify this, and accompanied by heathens, climbed to the top of the roof of the choir, on which there is an uncovered tabernacle, and they could not see a shadow of their length when they stood upright. This was tried by one pilgrim. From this you can see that Jerusalem is the middle of the world." So there is an empirical verification. Already in the prophets, the central position of Jerusalem is connected with internationality. According to Jeremiah 3:17, all nations will gather in Jerusalem. Similar verses, Josiah 63 and so on. Already under ancient Jewish sovereignty, the call to pilgrimage had made Jerusalem a place for it, where believers also from the diaspora met. Likewise, in the Middle Ages, Jerusalem was a center for different Christian denominations, but also for different religions and ethnicities. Thus writes Felix Fabri, "Other Christians from other denominations also came to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, women and men. With them also came many Muslims who wanted to see us, and there was a great crowd of people from all over the world and from all denominations in front of the church." There were contacts with Jewish inhabitants as well. Konrad von Grünenberg, who was just mentioned, a citizen of Constance, knows of a Jewish boy helping him and a brother pilgrim when they were visiting an Islamic bath in Jerusalem, as the Jewish boy guarded their clothes. Arnold von Harf, a young Rhenish nobleman, started his pilgrimage in 1496 at the age of about 25. He also described in detail the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and is accurate there. However, the young man not only traveled to the Holy Land and Jerusalem, but also visited other minor destinations and the two other important Christian long-distance pilgrim destinations, Rome and Santiago de Compostela. His large description of Rome, is there water? That would be nice. Oh, sorry. His large description of Rome competes with the one of Jerusalem. Impressively, he mentions the numerous relics from the Holy Land. May I take it? Thank you. It's not that elegant, but... Arnold von Harff mentions the numerous relics from the Holy Land in Rome, such as the holy stairs in the Lateran on which Christ had walked when Pilate summoned him. In view of his visit to Lateran Church in Rome, where the heads of St. Peter and Paul also rest, he states, "This is the principal church of Christendom. Das ist oberste Kirche in der Christenheit." His remark leaves one somewhat astonished, as one would expect a statement to be made about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Is it because he's bringing about the relativization of Jerusalem through his visit to numerous Catholic Christian pilgrimage places? Or because Europe's interest is beginning to shift gradually westward with the exciting discovery of the New World? For the young man, the centrality of Jerusalem and its position in the center of the world seems to be no longer quite so certain. Thus, in Jerusalem, he explains, rather distanced, that the center of the world should be in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Der seht man, dass it mit in der Welt sein sollte, es Gott selbst gesprochen habe. The Christian religious center now seemed to shift more toward Rome and Europe. This detachment from Jerusalem seems to be a tendency increasing with the rise of and encouraged by the Protestant Reformation. I'm coming to the end. Now, why should one still travel to Jerusalem? The Dean of Mainz Cathedral, Bernhard von Breidenbach, who traveled 1483, gives an answer to this question, which at the same time gives a theoretical base for pilgrimage as well as for travel, and thereby emphasizes the importance of pilgrimage. He discusses this subject in the preface of his extremely successful travelogue printed in 1486. Breidenbach mentions the general pilgrimage customs within Europe and starts from the ancient form of pilgrimage and travel as found among the Greeks and in Judaism, and thus explains the journey of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon in this sense. In addition, he emphasizes the importance of the senses for spiritual understanding. Thus, it is important to see with his own eyes or to touch with his own hand and mouth. Because of this, even if the journey to Jerusalem is not necessary for salvation, undertaken in a right attitude, it influences the senses and through creating an inner motion serves for a better understanding and or also for the improvement of one's own life. The assumed necessity of haptic or sensual experience adds to an understanding of the development of copies of Jerusalem sites in Europe as holy sepulchres or ways of the cross. These may present a central, also insufficient substitute for the singularity of the real Jerusalem, since, so argues Breidenbach, and this should serve here also as a final word or a conclusion, Breidenbach argues for the central importance and value of Jerusalem. He says, "It cannot be ignored that the view of the often mentioned sites serves very well to understand better these things of which one sings, reads, and preaches daily in the churches. For it is obvious, and many know it, that things seen move much more than things heard alone or things read in books. because we understand better in view of their actual existence than if they are shown to our eyes in their likeness, shaped by anyone other. Thank you so much for your attention.
Well, I think definitely the center of the world, and believe me, great mental baggage. And I would like to go to our Hebrew section of this morning, ולהזמין, אני שמחה להזמין את שלמה לוטן, דוקטור בלימודי ארץ ישראל וארכיאולוגיה מאוניברסיטת בר אילן. מחקרו עוסק במסדר הטבטוני והשפעתו על תולדותיה של ממלכת הצלבנים ומושבות המזרח הלטיני. שלמה אף בחן את המעורבות הטבטונית בארצות הבלטיות ואת ההשפעה של המעורבות הזאת על המטה בעכו ובמונפורט. שלמה לוטן פרסם מחקרים רבים על מסדרי האבירים, הטבטונים, ההוספיטלרים והטמפלרים, אותם מסדרים צבאיים שפעלו בתחומה של ממלכת ירושלים, והוא מרצה ומדריך במכון אבשלום וביד בן-צבי, והאמת היא שיש לנו בשנים האחרונות קורס סיורים משותף פה. הוא גם פעיל כמתכנן ערים ואזורים, מלמד בתוכניות האקדמיות של אוניברסיטת בר אילן על עירוניות, תכנון ערים ושימור אתרים היסטוריים, והוא ידבר על ייחודה, קדושתה ומרכזיותה של ירושלים בכרוניקות גרמניות בשלהי ימי הביניים. בבקשה.
תודה לך אורית על ההקדמה הנפלאה. אנחנו אכן עובדים במשותף ונהנים מאוד ביחד לעסוק בתחום האהוב עלינו, הצלבנים. אני אדבר בשפתנו המוזרה, כך שזאת תהיה אתנחתא קלה מאנגלית, ואני אספר לכם על כרוניקות גרמניות שנכתבו בשלהי ימי הביניים וציינו את ירושלים, את המורכבות שלה ואת הגיאוגרפיה הקדושה כאן. אז בבקשה. המסדרים הצבאיים היו אחת מאותן יצירות מקוריות אשר נוסדו בעיר ירושלים ובמזרח הפרנקי בימי הביניים במאה ה-12. מוסדות אלה תרמו רבות לשרידותה של ממלכת ירושלים הצלבנית, בעיקר במאה ה-13. שמה של ירושלים נישא בכותר שמם של אותם ארגונים צבאיים ורוחניים, בהם שירתו אבירים ונזירים, לוחמים ואנשי דת, אשר יצרו מרקם ייחודי בתחומה של הממלכה הפרנקית. המסדרים הצבאיים המוכרים והמרכזיים, אשר תרומתם לממלכה הצלבנית הייתה מכרעת, היו ההוספיטלרים, מסדר יוחנן הקדוש מירושלים. מסדר זה הוקם בשנת 1113 כמוסד סיעודי באכסניה בלב העיר בקרבת כנסיית הקבר, הייליגה גרב. המסדר השני המוכר לרבים היה מסדר הבירי היכל שלמה מירושלים, הידוע בשם מסדר הטמפלרים, אשר הוקם בשנת 1119-1120 בירושלים, בעת ראשית כהונתו של המלך בלדווין השני, אשר מלך בשנים 1118 עד 1131. באותה עת מסר המלך הצלבן את מעונו בהר הבית, באתר אשר זכה לשם טמפלום סלומוניס, מקדש שלמה, לידי הטמפלרים, והעתיק את משכנו מערבה אל ארמון המלך בקרבת מצודת דוד. המסדר השלישי בחשיבותו, נשוא הרצאה זו, הינו מסדר מרים הקדושה בירושלים, מסדר הגרמנים, או בשמו המוכר מסדר הטבטונים, אשר נוסד בעיר עכו בשנת 1198. זאת לאחר כיבוש ירושלים על ידי האיובים בשנת 1187 בעקבות מפלת קרב קרני חיטין. בשבוע שעבר היינו בזירת הקרב וראינו את המקום הייחודי הזה, והתבססותם של הצלבנים באותה עת בערי החוף הרחק מבירתם בעיר הקדושה לנצרות. יש לציין תחילה כי לטבטונים לא הייתה אחיזה רבה בעיר ירושלים, כדוגמת ההוספיטלרים באזור המוריסטן והטמפלרים במתחם הר הבית. עם השבתה של ירושלים אל חיק הנצרות במסע הצלב השישי בשנת 1229, בעת מסעו של קיסר האימפריה הרומית הקדושה פרידריך השני, רק אז נמסרו מספר נכסים לידיהם של הטבטונים, ובהם מצודת העיר ומספר בתים ברובע הארמני של ימינו, ואתר נוסף בקרבת כנסיית הקבר. חשוב לי לציין כבר כעת כי אין כל עדות כי אותה כנסייה ובית חולים גרמני הניצבים בלב הרוב היהודי של ימינו נזכרו בכרוניקות של הטפטונים. אתרים אלה ניצבו הרחק מליבת ההתיישבות הנוצרית המצומצמת במערב העיר במחצית הראשונה של המאה ה-13 בין השנים 1229 לשנת 1244. לפיכך, מוזר הדבר כי דווקא במאות ה-15 ובראשית המאה ה-16, מאות שנים לאחר אובדנה של ירושלים לנצרות, נכתבו מספר כרוניקות גרמניות ייחודיות על ירושלים, במפקדות מסדר הטפטונים בלב גרמניה, בחבל פרנקוניה, בארצות השפלה ובפרוסיה, בחבל הבלטי, בצפון מזרח אירופה. כרוניקות אלה התבססו בחלקן על כתבים ותיאורים טפטונים מוקדמים שנכתבו על ידי אנשי הדת חברי המסדר, כדוגמת כתביו של פטר פון דויסבורג, מחבר הכרוניקה המרכזית על תולדות הטפטונים, כרוניקון טרה פרוסיה, במחצית הראשונה של המאה ה-14, זמן לא רב לאחר נפילתה של הממלכה הצלבנית לידי הממלוכים בשנת 1291. מדוע נכתבו אותן כרוניקות מאוחרות המוכרות בשמן הגרמני? דר כרוניק דר פיר אורדן פון ירושלם, הכרוניקה של ארבעת המסדרים מירושלים, וכן די יונגרה הוכמייסטר קרוניק, הכרוניקה של ראשי המסדר הקדומים או הראשונים. לשאלה זו אנסה לענות בסוגיה הקשורה במעמדה של העיר ירושלים, אך תחילה אתאר את הכתבים הגרמניים ואת ייחודם. הכרוניקה הגרמנית הראשונה אותה אציין בפניכם היא כרוניקת ראשי המסדר הקדומים, אשר נכתבה בראשית המאה ה-16 במפקדת הטפטונים ביישוב אוטרכט בהולנד. הכרוניקה השנייה, כרוניקת ארבעת המסדרים מירושלים, נכתבה במחצית השנייה של המאה ה-15 בחבל פרנקוניה בלב גרמניה של ימינו, במפקדת הטפטונים ביישוב מרגנטהיים בקרבת וירצבורג. כרוניקה זו קשרה את תולדותיהם של ארבעת המסדרים המובילים, ההוספיטלרים, הטמפלרים, הטפטונים, וכן מסדר הקנונים של כנסיית הקבר אל ארץ הקודש ובעיקר אל העיר הקדושה ירושלים. החוט המקשר בין הכרוניקות הנזכרות כאן הוא ניסיון הכותבים לקשור בין שורשי המסדרים לבין מהלכי ומעשי דמויות מובילות במקרא ובספרות הרוחנית המאוחרת, כדוגמת אברהם, דוד המלך וכן המכבים הלוחמים בכופרים באמונה. השימוש בדמויות המכבים ובעיקר בשמו של יהודה המכבי אינו כוזר לתקופה זו. הטפטונים אימצו את דמותו של יהודה המכבי כדמות המובילה את לוחמיו בארצות הבלטיות ומשרה את האמונה בניצחונם באויבי הנצרות. גם הצלבנים עשו שימוש רב בשמם של המכבים וציינו את גבורתם כמודל לחיקוי ולתעוזה בשדה הקרב. בהקשר זה אדגיש כי כבר בשנת 1230 כינה האפיפיור גרגוריוס התשיעי את הטפטונים בשם המכבים החדשים, זאת בשל הגנתם על גבולות הממלכה בגליל ובניית מבצרם החדש באתר שזכה לכינוי ההר החזק, מונפורט או שטרקנברג בגרמנית. על הטפטונים נטען כי בדומה למכבים גם הם פעלו כשליחי האמונה בלחימתם בכופרים, כך בארצות הבלטיות בהן נלחמו האבירים הגרמנים מלחמת חורמה בשבטים הפגנים בפרוסיה ובליבוניה, לטביה של ימינו. הם פעלו כשליחיה של הכנסייה וכמפיצי תורתה בחבלים החדשים שנכבשו בשם הנצרות. ניכר כי הטפטונים ואנשי הדת שבקרבם בחרו להשתמש בדימוי המכבים, זאת כדי להביא לתדמית חיובית למסדרם בתקופה בה נלחמו עשרות שנים באכזריות רבה באותם עובדי אלילים אשר סירבו להתנצר ולקבל את האמונה הנכונה לטענתם. סוגיה חשובה, גיאוגרפית דווקא, העולה בכרוניקות הללו היא מרכזיותו של אתר הר ציון בתולדות המסדרים הצבאיים. בשלהי ימי הביניים, בתקופה בה הפך הר ציון למוקד כינוס מוביל וכאתר ראשון במעלה לצליינים המבקרים בירושלים הממלוכים, ושמענו על זה כאן, נזכר ההר כמוקד לפעילותם של המסדרים הצבאיים שהתבססו בעיר הקדושה. ידוע כי הר ציון שימש באותה תקופה, בשלהי ימי הביניים, כמרכזם של הפרנצ'יסקנים, להם ניתנה החסות על הנוצרים המבקרים והשוהים בארץ הקודש, ייתכן ומכאן עלתה מרכזיותו של האתר. על פי המסורת הנוצרית הנזכרת בכרוניקת 4 המסדרים, הלנה, אמו של הקיסר קונסטנטין, הקימה בהר ציון, שימו לב, 2 בתי חולים לרווחת תושבי ירושלים. מאות שנים לאחר מכן העניק המלך הצלבן, בלדווין הראשון, שכיהן בשנים 1100 עד 1118, תרומות נכבדות להפיכת מוסדות אלה לשני אתרי סיעוד מובילים בעיר. אלה היו היסודות להקמת מסדר ההוספיטל בעיר ירושלים, וכן המקור לביסוס מסדר הטפטונים בעיר. להם בתקנונם ניתן מקום נכבד בתחום הסיעוד. תופעה זו מצביעה על העתקת מסורות ושיוך היסטורי אל אתרים גיאוגרפיים חדשים אשר התפתחו ונזכרו בשלהי ימי הביניים על ידי המבקרים בעיר ירושלים. סביר להניח כי כותבי הכרוניקות המאוחרות לא היו מעורים בהתפתחויות הגיאוגרפיות וההיסטוריות אותן עברה העיר ירושלים בתקופה הצלבנית. ידוע כי מתחם ההוספיטל שכן בלב העיר, בתחום הרובע הנוצרי, בקרבת כנסיית הקבר ורובע הפטריארך. המתחם גבל בשתי כנסיות מרכזיות, סנטה מריה לטינה וסנטה מריה גרנדה, אשר שרידיהן מוכרים לנו היום במתחם כנסיית הגואל ובלב שוק המוריסטן, המשמר אף הוא בשמו את המונח בית חולים. בתקופה הצלבנית תיארו עולי רגל אחדים את חשיבות מתחם בית החולים, מתחם ההוספיטל, וציינו כי היה זה אתר בו זכו רבים למחסה, למאכל ולסעד רפואי. יוהן מווירצבורג, אשר ביקר בירושלים בתחילת שנות ה-60 של המאה ה-12, ציין כי מספר המיטות אשר הוקצו לחולים באתר מרכזי זה היה כ-2,000. גם הטפטונים עסקו בסעד החולים הנעים בתחום הממלכה. ידוע על הקמתו של בית חולים טפטוני בחלקה המזרחי של העיר עכו בשלהי המאה ה-12 ברובעם של הגרמנים, אלמני, וכן על מינוי בעל תפקיד האחראי על הנושא, ספיטלר. בירושלים עצמה הגרמנים, או טרם הקמת מסדר הטפטונים, הקימו בית חולים לצד כנסייתם, היום ברובע היהודי. חוקר הרפואה הצלבנית פרופסור מיטשל העריך במחקרו המוביל על הרפואה הצלבנית, מחקר משנת 2004, כי באתר זה מוקמו כ100 מיטות ודרגשים לטיפול בחולים הנזקקים לסעד רפואי. דומה אם כן כי כותבי הכרוניקות בימי הביניים המאוחרים ביקשו לקשור בין תולדותיהם של המסדרים הצבאיים המובילים אל המקומות הקדושים לנצרות ואל הדמויות המקראיות הלוחמות למען האמונה הנוצרית. בכרוניקות אלה ניכר הקשר אל ארץ הקודש ובעיקר אל ירושלים כמקור להקמת המסדרים. הדבר זיכה את מוסדות המסדרים הצבאיים בעילה ובחשיבות רבה ברחבי העולם הנוצרי. שמם נישא בשמה של העיר הקדושה בה התבססה הנצרות בראשיתה. חשוב לציין עובדה ייחודית והיא היעדר פירוט רב והסבר על הקמתם ותולדותיהם של הטמפלרים בירושלים. ידוע כי אבירי היכל שלמה היו הגורם המיליטנטי בתולדות הממלכה. מדוע אם כן לא ניתן להם, לאותם לוחמים, משקל רב בכרוניקות הגרמניות? להערכתי, הסיבה לכך היא גורלם המר של הטמפלרים, אשר לאחר נפילתה של ממלכת הצלבנים בשנת 1291 הואשמו כגורם המרכזי לאובדנה של הממלכה. זאת בשל עצמאותם הרבה, חתרנותם והקשרים שרקמו עם המוסלמים, הסרצנים. הטמפלרים נרדפו ולבסוף בתחילת המאה ה-14 נושלו מכל זכויותיהם. באותה עת, בשלהי ימי הביניים, הטפטונים מיענו להזכיר את מעלליהם מחשש ויפגעו אף הם כטמפלרים במערב אירופה. מאות שנים לאחר אותם אירועים נותרו ההוספיטלרים במחזיהם באגן הים התיכון, באותה עת באי רודוס ולאחר מכן באי מלטה, והטבטונים במפקדותיהם בצפון אירופה, בעיקר בגרמניה, אוסטריה, בוהמיה והולנד. ניתן לסכם ולומר כי מטרתן העיקרית של כרוניקות אלו הייתה לחזק את הקשר של המסדר אל עברם ואל מורשתם העתיקה בירושלים, ומכאן להביא לעלייה במעמדם בעולם הנוצרי. הטבטונים נזקקו לחיזוקים אלה במאה ה-16 בין אנשי הכנסייה והאצולה הגרמנית, בתקופה בה ידעו משברים צבאיים ונסיגה בשטחיהם בצפון מזרח אירופה בארצות הבלטיות. היה זה מעין תמריץ אידיאולוגי, דוגמת מורשת קרב, שיר הלל להקמתם ולייחודם בתולדות הממלכה הפרנקית, בעיקר בהאדרת דרכם בעיר הקדושה ירושלים, אשר שמה נישא בפי כל בעולם הנוצרי וגם כעת במסגרת כנס זה. תודה רבה.
אז תודה רבה לשלמה וגם להרצאה וגם על העמידה בלוח הזמנים. And to our last speaker, Megan Armstrong, who is a professor of history at McMaster University and presently chair of the department. She is a specialist on religion and politics with a special focus on early modern Catholicism and Holy Land. Her most recent publication is The Holy Land and the Early Modern Reinvention of Catholicism, 2021. She is presently working on 3 book projects: Global Pilgrimage to the Holy Land under a contract with Routledge, Eastern Possession and Religious Coexistence in Early Modern Jerusalem, and Collecting for the Holy Land, the Commissioners of the Holy Land in the Global Expansion of Early Modern Catholic Church. And we'll be hearing some of this research right now. Please.
Okay, first of all, like everyone else, I'd like to thank Orit and Nico and Amnon for including me in this wonderful conference. I cannot tell you how stimulating I found every session, and including the one I'm in so far, the papers that have come. So without further ado, I'll get into my project. It's a little bit different from the others here because I focus on the administration of the custody. So I'm interested in the Holy Land as the umbilicus mundi in the Catholic tradition in particular, but also through its administrative role. So first of all, this paper today explores the Commissioners of the Holy Land, a unique alms-gathering institution that has long played an active role in promoting Catholic devotion to the Christian holy places through its role in circulating alms and religious mementos. And it's done so between not only Jerusalem and Europe, but during the early modern, it expands into the Atlantic as well. Today I want to discuss one dimension that I think is critical for understanding the global expansion of Holy Land devotion during the 16th and 17th centuries, and that's the formative partnership of the Spanish state and the custody through this institution of the commissioners. The Spanish monarchy was the single most important patron of the custody by the 15th century. From the 16th century onwards, commissioners boarded Spanish ships headed for the farthest reaches of its expanding empire, carrying religious mementos and returning with monies and other forms of religious donations in support of the custody and its work overseeing Catholic pilgrimage in Jerusalem. My research on the correspondence of the commissioners found in the National Archives of Madrid, that's where I've been working more recently, illustrates a partnership that politically, spiritually, and economically benefited both friar and Spanish monarchy. On the one hand, the Franciscan commissioners had the advantage of the support of a powerful political and spiritual protector and access to its great transnational, transregional resources. On the other hand, the Spanish monarchy saw its own political and religious authority enhanced through its material and ideological association with a revered Franciscan pilgrimage institution, one that by virtue of its mobile spiritual character and location within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire extended its political reach deeply into the Eastern Mediterranean. So that's the thrust of my talk today. So I'm going to begin first by briefly introducing the commissioners, and then I'm going to go into discussing how the commissioners functioned in ways that served Spanish interests. And then in the conclusion, I'm going to come back to why I think this is important for thinking about the Holy Land as a center of Catholic devotion at a time of global expansion. So hopefully that's a clear structure. So I'm beginning with an image taken from the website of the Commissioners of the Holy Land. If you go to the website of the Custodia Terra Sancta, you'll immediately find them. This is an institution that is almost as old as the custody itself. The commissioners have existed formally since the 15th century. They're still functioning today. Here they're worshiping in the cenacle as recently as 2018. And as you can see, you probably can't see from this image, but they're all Franciscan still. So who are the commissioners? I think the best way to understand the commissioners is to understand them as, I'm going to make sure I know how to use this. That worked. The commissioners are a fiscal administration that was specifically established to gather alms to support the work of the custody. Now, the custody, many of you know this already. We had a tour a few days ago. The custody is the main Catholic pilgrimage institution in Jerusalem. It was formally established in 1342 through negotiations between the rulers of Naples and the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt. So it has been here for 700 years formally, and it has been run by the Franciscan order since that time. So they've been here for over 700 years, managing the same institution. The commissioners were established to support this administration. Here I have an image of what's probably, they claim to be the oldest of the commissariats, Naples, which makes sense going back to sort of that Neapolitan heritage. Here, as you can see, we have a number of the commissioners who are sitting around a replica of the Holy Sepulchre. I'll come to a few more of these later on, but these are the kind of religious mementos which were created in workshops attached to the Church of the Nativity under the care of the Franciscans from the 15th century onward, and that were being then sold, distributed by commissioners to European markets, later colonial markets, and in return they would bring alms back to Jerusalem. So this just gives you a little taste of the kind of work that they're still doing to this day. It has a long history. Today there are 84 commissariats, by the way, around the globe. So this is an institution still with global reach. And surprisingly, it's received very little attention from historians. So hopefully I can fill in some of the gaps today. The role, as I said, was to collect alms. We find commissioners first established in the Kingdom of Naples as early as the 14th century, informally by the King of Naples. By the 15th century, a more formal structure exists. By this time, they're appointed by the custos, the Franciscan head of the custody, and they're sent out at certain times of the year to go to Europe to gather alms and to collect from the merchant colonies, the Christian merchant colonies in the Levant. By the 16th century, it grows significantly, and it's this period in the 16th and 17th century that the Spanish state starts to play an even bigger role. By the end of the 16th century, through the backing of the Spanish state and the papacy, we will have 13 commissioner generals established around the Mediterranean. I have a map of this coming up shortly. And the institution itself will grow. They'll increase the number of commissioners, and they will also increase the sort of the geographic reach of their roles in collecting alms. After 1606, Spain opened its colonial territories to Franciscan commissioners, making the Spanish New World, by the end of the 17th century, the single largest contributor to alms for the Holy Land. So that in itself already shows how important a role Spain has played to funding the work of the custody. In other words, the commissioners general that I'm going to be talking about today came to serve as another dynamic interconnecting Spanish trading networks in the Atlantic with those in the Mediterranean through the circulation of alms and mementos to and from Jerusalem, out through the Kingdom of Naples, Madrid, and into the Atlantic, amongst other port cities. So why would this partnership develop? What benefited the Spanish monarchy to support the work of the commissioners? And I'm going to briefly talk about two roles that they played. First of all, the importance of alms as a way of manifesting Spanish claims to Christian leadership, and in particular Catholic leadership, at a time of intense competition and conflict amongst Catholic nations in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And secondly, as a very valuable information network. So many of you might already know this. Oh, I just want to mention, this is the Basilica Real de San Francisco del Grande in Madrid. This is the home of the Commissioner General of Madrid, which is the highest Spanish commissioner in the structure to this day. The archives I'm working on come from this institution. And this, I'm mentioning it because it was based in Madrid, and Madrid, of course, is the center of power in the Spanish Empire. And the correspondence I'm working on shows that there's a close working relationship between this commissioner, which oversees all of the commissioners working in the Atlantic as well as the Mediterranean, who report back on what's going on in their endeavors. This is not a very useful slide. I put it in just as a reminder that they're part of these existing trading networks that are expanding in this time into the Atlantic as well. So the commissioners are traveling well-traveled routes. Now, the next couple of slides, I mentioned my uncritical slides. Here are a few examples. I think what I want to do is just to at least give a material face to the kinds of mementos that were circulating. Alms, of course, came in many forms. They came in monies, but they also came in supplies for the work of the custody, food, material for clothing, liturgical devotional objects, liturgical vestments, anything to help them perform their work, anything that would help them not only decorate the chapels for visiting pilgrims, but renovate the spaces and also support the work of the friars themselves. And so here we have a modern example of the kind of mementos still being created in Bethlehem and elsewhere out of local materials. In this case, olive wood, going right back to my period, is very important. This is a modern example. Of course, here are two early modern examples of replicas of the Holy Sepulchre, similar to the one that I showed earlier. These are made of mother of pearl. We saw one again at the custody when we were visiting. These were again made in Bethlehem under the supervision of the friars by local Christian artisans and then sent out deliberately for exportation. Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre needs no introduction after this conference. Here are just a couple of slides of first Calvary and another of the altars. These are Latin altars. As many of you know, these are shared Christian the holy places are mostly shared between the different Christian traditions who have different altars. What I wanted to do is just give a sense of the importance of the ornamentation to explain why this was visually useful for manifesting Spanish power. Because if you were a pilgrim in the 16th and 17th century, when you went into these spaces, what you would have been confronted with were these highly ornate spaces that would be filled with devotional objects and silver, gold, and other valuable materials that were coming from wealthy benefactors in Europe and elsewhere. And Spain was the single most important benefactor, and it ensured that it had the most lavish of all the ornaments in many cases. And so pilgrims will report on these, for example, this enormous, beautiful silver Spanish lamp stamped with the coat of arms and so forth. And so one of the objectives of the Spanish monarchy during this era was to stamp its face in the holy places in Catholic chapels so that all visiting Christians would see it as they went through and would be aware of the wealth and greatness of the Spanish king and its piety. And of course, the other thing we have to keep in mind is that the circulation of alms was being circulated on Spanish ships in the bodies of Spanish friars as well. So there was a material manifestation of this Spanish spiritual authority that was being built into the custody, including control of the fiscal administration. And I mention this because at the same time that they're patronizing the alms, the alms, the traffic in alms and so forth, they're also crafting these historical and genealogical narratives in which the Spanish king, going from Ferdinand but to Philip II and later on to Philip III, that they are successors, their ancestors go back to King David of Jerusalem. They also trace it to Louis IX, the great Crusader king of France. So they're trying to draw these genealogical and historical narratives that make them this kind of historic protector of the holy places. So on the one hand, I think ideologically it serves their interests in a very important way. But I want to talk about another side that doesn't get much attention, and I'll say why this is the focus of my present research. And here is, again, a very crude map, and I am embarrassed. I personally drew on the blue dots just before this conference. At some point, I'm going to have to do a better job, but I thought it would have to have visible representation of where all the commissariats are located in 1593. And there's a reason for it. And I just want to point your attention that, first of all, as you can see, the dots are in major port cities that are on the way to Jerusalem. Malta, of course, is very important. Naples, these are big Spanish gateways. These are areas of Spanish influence directly through territorial possession, but also just through alliance. Also, if you look up through all the Italian states, make perfect sense. Venice, in particular, is a gateway. Vienna is a Habsburg power that's a center of the Habsburg Empire, and that is a close ally of Spain. And then, of course, when you go around there you've got Marseille, which, of course, is the port city of France, the rival of Spain, but into Madrid and then Lisbon. Yeah, Lisbon is cut off. I'm mentioning this because one of the things we need to realize about these Franciscan commissioners is they're traveling constantly, and they're circulating through all of these port cities as they gather, and they're working with the commissioner generals to organize and mobilize funds and goods and so forth. And this made them extraordinarily useful experts on what was going on in the Mediterranean. I think one thing we need to realize is that as these men traveled, they gave the Spanish state access to a region that, in fact, they did not even have access to, because the Spanish state did not have standing relations with the Ottoman Empire. So the eastern basin of the Mediterranean in particular was of difficult political access for the Spanish state, unlike France, for example, which was a trading partner of the Ottomans. And so it's with this that I want to come to my final points. Here's a letter from one of my commissioners, Franciscan Domingo de Larzaval. This letter is from 1666. He was actually a commissioner from 1657 to 1698. So he was a commissioner for 44 years. And what we learned from his letters and those of the other commissioners is that they had extensive networks of connection. In his letters, of which he wrote hundreds during the time that I'm investigating, he is in communication regularly, not only with the Commissioner General in Madrid, who he had to report to, and to all the other commissioners who were working in the fields, but also with local Ottoman officials, the Cadi, the governor in Damascus, with the Ottoman viziers at the port, as well as with European ambassadors, and of course with the propaganda fide in Rome, so the Vatican, and the head of the the Franciscan administration in Rome. So he had these extensive ongoing communications with a variety of officials, political and religious, as well as local community officials, like local Christians. And these communications show us, first of all, that these commissioners operated in a trans-imperial context with networks that transcended imperial boundaries in ways that were extremely useful to an empire like the Spanish state. And secondly, it's very clear they were asked to report on things that went well beyond alms gathering. His letters talk about everything that's going on at the time, not only in Jerusalem, but in Palestine more generally, and even in the Mediterranean. And when they're traveling, commissioners are also reporting on what's going on. So they talk about wars, they talk about local political relations, they talk about conflicts, they talk about plague. But the whole point is they're providing an ongoing, continual source of information on every facet of business. And to my mind, it brings me to my final point, that the Franciscans themselves, I'm going to make a brief conclusion after, but I just want to particularly say why the Franciscans were so useful in this regard as a mobile information network. And I think there are three important reasons for it that have to do with their distinctive spirituality as a Catholic tradition, and the fact that they had legal standing in Ottoman lands. And so first of all, in terms of their their tradition, I think we need to understand that Franciscan spirituality was a unique tradition within the Catholic faith. This was a tradition that goes back to Francis of Assisi, who viewed homelessness as the ideal. In other words, mobility was at the core of its tradition. Mobility was a spiritual state of purity because it meant one was unmoored to the forces of the world. The world was a corrupting force. The Franciscan vow of poverty and humility flowed from this conception, making journeying, both spiritual and physical, the natural state of the friar, necessary to seeking and preserving its state of purity. Though convents became the recognized place of rest for friars, mobility was enshrined at every level of the order, including its administration through the rotation of offices, and also its role of wandering preaching and alms collecting. Thus, the Franciscan order itself, through its extensive networks of convents, chapels, and hospices, preaching ministry, alms collecting, and rotation of offices, manifested a spiritual conception of purity that facilitated the global expansion of the order. This is one of the orders that to this day has a global presence and has since this period. And it's because it was designed to ensure this constant flow of friars through space. Secondly, Spanish friars in the commissioners were part of the custody, which meant that they had legal and political access to a region through the custody's privileges under Ottoman rule, access to regions that the Spanish state did not have ready legal access. And this meant that as we, those of us who work on this, which is everyone at this conference, knows that during the medieval and early modern periods, very few non-Muslims could enter Ottoman lands without permission. It was a very small group, even of pilgrims who would come annually. But Mamluk and Ottoman sultans welcomed financial gifts from Western countries to the care and maintenance of the holy places, because pilgrimage is something that they also made money from, and it also glorified the shrines of the Holy Land under their direction. And so they welcomed the collection of alms and the circulation of mementos in support of it. And so these Franciscan networks that were already made locally through the custody gave the Spanish church, through its Spanish friars, political access to a degree that it did not have on its own. And thirdly and finally, I think we need to recognize that these men were highly experienced individuals who could be trusted for their information. I mentioned Lardizival here, who worked for 44 years, working in and out, circulating in and out of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas of the custody. These men understood the terrain, they understood local cultures, and so they could be relied on to provide, well, hopefully accurate advice, but at least expert local advice in a way that those who were unfamiliar with the land would be unable to do. So in conclusion, why do I consider the commissioners interesting to explore? Well, I'm going to make 2 points here. Briefly, the first one is, I think we haven't done enough work on alms gathering and these alms gathering networks across the Great Faith as communication networks. I think the Mediterranean, what's interesting that comes out of this research to me is that the Mediterranean during the medieval and early modern periods is awash with alms gatherers from all the traditions, not just Christian, but Muslim and Jewish as well. In the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, in the Red Sea, all with alms that are being gathered for Mecca, Medina, and for Jerusalem. And that kind of work, the more we can do on these wanderers, I think we could understand better the flow of information in the Mediterranean as well as its religious culture. And secondly, and final point I want to make goes to the heart of the theme of this conference. And I think it has to do with these friars, these commissioners, as vessels of the Holy Land itself to an expanding Catholic tradition. It makes me wonder, to begin with, whether their role as not only barriers of mementos, but also reporters on the Holy Land itself, as material witness to its spiritual power, that also made these friars of special utility in the expansion of the Catholic faith into the New World and elsewhere. These men, after all, were members of a religious order that had a material presence in the holy places. They were members of a tradition that believed sacrality could infuse and transform anything it touched, including human bodies. The commissioners, as friars, were spiritual experts for early modern Catholics because they were carriers of its sacrality, the same as pilgrims. As they moved through on behalf of their duties, they were carrying the Holy Land with them, keeping it at the center of an ever-expanding Catholic tradition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan, for a wonderful talk. Although all speakers were very punctual, I believe we don't have time for questions. Well, so all I have to do is to announce a break.